Okay, we're going to move from culture and values to leading. So how do you lead in the change, and how do you to an effective culture, and then how do you maintain a positive culture, especially given the trying times we have now? Um, we talk about change. We have to be change ready in our organizations now. All of us, even before the pandemic, we were trying to deal with new technology, global competition, legal changes, the growth and increased complexity of how we do business. And now we have the pandemic. And you look at what's happening with the hurricanes and everything else that's happening this year. There's a lot of disruption, and we have to deal with that and change and adapt to that as well. So how do you lead an adaptive organization, and one that is adaptive to change? First of all, there has to be a willingness to make change. And when we talk about change, the change process involves unfreezing what you currently do or believe, implementing the change or the change process, and then refreezing the new change and making that part of your everyday business practice and your everyday behavior. So what we're talking about here is these are the elements to bring that change on, to make it an adaptive organization. So there has to be a willingness to make change. Not only from leadership, but from the employees. Because if the employees aren't up to it, it's not going to happen. You have to identify the problems quickly. And that's being the innovative, adaptive organization. Related to that, you have to have internal and external scanning or looking. You look at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, both within the organization and externally in your environment, your competitors, your suppliers, what's going on with the economy, those types of things. And so you constantly want to be up to date on what your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are, so you can adapt to the changes in the environment. You need to be able to implement solutions rapidly. A lot of times when companies are locked in paradigms, they don't shift very fast. They're stuck in the old practices, but to build an adaptive organization, you have to have a process to come up with solutions to deal with these opportunities and threats and overcome your weaknesses as fast as possible. So there has to be a focus on innovation, trying new things, sometimes being disruptive to what you do, and focusing on new revenue streams, new practices, new efficiencies. You need to encourage upward communication. It can't just be downward. You have to talk to your employees. They know those jobs best. They know they can come up with solutions if you ask them. So you just can't assume that you're always right when you're not doing the job on a day-to-day basis, or you're not producing the products on a day-to-day basis, or the services, and you're not always communicating with the customers on a day-to-day basis. And lastly, trust is critical. Your employees, like I said, if they're reluctant to change, it's going to be hard to get the organization to change. So there has to be a level of trust where when you say we need to do this in a different way, or we need to move away from this product line and focus on this, they have to understand that you've done your due diligence and you've done the research, you're listening to customers, and you're changing for the better of the organization. And so that culture of trust is a critical element. And that's related to effective upward communication and effective employee relations, which Gary's going to talk about. Some of the prerequisites that you want to do to build this change: you want to have a vision. It's like what we said earlier, a purpose for your culture. You need to have a vision for what you want the change to do and where you want to be a year later or 2 years later, once you've gone through the change process and implement it and look at the results. You need a compelling need, and and you need to share that need. So why are we changing? We're not, you don't want your employees to think you're changing for change's sake. So that goes back to the vision and purpose. You have to have the practical means to achieve the vision. So there has to be planning. You have to have time to develop the process or what you're doing, and then you have to implement it. And you have to have the resources to be able to do that effectively, whether that's designating personnel or maybe purchasing tools and equipment or whatever it might take to actually get to where you need to go. You need to have rewards. You need to align appropriate behavior with the vision you have for the change. So in terms of pay, in terms of bonuses, and all those types of extrinsic rewards, those are important. But almost as important are the intrinsic rewards, that a person feels satisfaction because they helped accomplish the change, that the person feels like they've been recognized by other employees, especially leadership, because they helped move the change along. And feedback relates just back to the communication. When you are implementing change, the employees need feedback on how they're doing. It's just like any other performance issue. Employees want feedback, and feedback is an intrinsic reward for the job you're doing. People view feedback from a psychological point of view, good or bad, as a way that you're trying to work with them and interconnect with them and have the same shared beliefs about where the organization's going and what they need to be doing in their job. So what do effective change leaders do? They embrace change when it's needed. Because I mentioned the employees sometimes are reluctant to change. Leaders are just as reluctant. But the old saying, if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you always got. Well, you got to embrace change or you're not going to change how you're doing things. You're not going to adapt. I mean, a lot of us are old enough to remember video stores, especially Blockbuster. Boy, I mean, most of us have Netflix accounts now, right? They actually had an opportunity to buy Netflix back in the day when Netflix was a mail order situation. That was their business model. But can you imagine the transformation that would have happened if they would have gotten involved with Netflix? And then as Netflix moved to online and streaming and all the production they're doing now, Blockbuster would have had a whole different perspective besides going bankrupt. And there's other examples of that as well. So we need to embrace change as a leader. We're the ones that have to develop the vision. Now we might get input. We should get input from our employees on the kinds of changes that are needed, but vision generally comes from the top and then is worked down the organization, and then through communication, feedback, and listening, we make sure that there's buy-in for that change from the bottom up in the organization. So communication, being an effective communicator, is critical, especially in times where communication is tough, like when people are working remotely. Now, I tend to think and believe that even when the pandemic's over, hopefully by next year, that might be positive thinking. We hope and we know that there's going to be many more people working remotely. They've adapted. They've adjusted their schedules. They like it. It requires less commercial real estate space, allows the company to reduce expenses in specific areas. So we have to learn how to communicate in these remote environments. Some of it will go away, but not all of it, because we're realizing that people can be effective. We're realizing we can get cost savings from remote work. Effective leaders have to be willing to shake things up and challenge the status quo. and encourage others to do the same. That goes along with the innovation process. If you aren't willing to challenge the status quo, the best thing you're going to get are very small incremental improvements that may not make you successful and sustainable in the long run. Sometimes you have to be more disruptive, and you have to challenge your employees to be more creative and solve things in different ways. Effective leaders stay involved. They walk the walk, and they're very visible about it. They check in on their employees. They see how they're doing, how they're dealing with the change, because change can be tough. And they're constantly involved in directing, reviewing, and implementing the change. So you don't just light the fire and walk away. You light the fire, you make sure everybody else catches on fire with what you're doing, and you're there to listen, you're there to direct and give information, and you're there to be a coach. As a leader or a participant in the change process, there are outcomes that you need to realize could happen. And I, for one, in the change we've dealt with in our university environment, have felt a sense of loss and confusion. I mean, the loss of the interpersonal interaction, the confusion about sometimes how we're going to do things, the confusion about how we're going to schedule classes, all those things. And I'm sure in your own environments, you felt that same way, having to deal with the change that's been brought on by current situations. But that happens in any change process. There tends to be an initial mistrust and a focus on me. You know, how is this change going to impact me? And I may not always trust that things are going to work out for me. And this is critical in employee retention, because when I'm not trusting what's going on in my organization, I might be more likely to look outside for other opportunities. And it could just be a lack of communication between leadership and employees that's causing this, and they could be cleared up if we are more intentional about our communication. We have a fear of letting go of what's been successful in the past. And that's the whole paradigm shift issue we talked about before. Sometimes we have to let those things go because they're not going to be successful. You know, on a higher level, I mean, we can't. If Blockbuster would have let go of the brick and mortar and other video stores and moved more towards the digital, the online, and things early on, they might have survived as a company. As a smaller business, that's especially true. I often see smaller businesses focusing on one revenue stream or even one major customer. And when those things happen and that major customer goes away, it can be detrimental to the company. I worked with a pillow manufacturer several years ago who had two major customers. And one was having solvency problems and was a credit risk in terms of giving them a line of credit to order their pillows and bed products. And if that company would go under, it would be a good chance that this small pillows and bed products manufacturer would go under too. And so you've got to be very careful about that. You obviously want to maintain those revenue streams, but you always have to work on how do we add new revenue streams, new products that keep us sustainable over time. Again, people hold on to and value the past. It's the same as the fear of letting go almost. There's a lot of uncertainty, which leads to low stability and high emotional stress. You know, a lot of people working remotely have stress because what do they do with their kids? What do they do with their family? How does work bleed into the family life? And the stress of, will my job be here next month? All of those things that we know not only we are feeling, but our employees are feeling, our friends are feeling. And so there has to be some stress management built in as we deal with dramatic change. We tend to perceive high levels of inconsistency in management practice and management communication. So that means we have to be much more intentional about those things. We tend to have high energy under the process of change, but if we don't direct it, it becomes destructive. And control becomes a major issue. Managers tend to clamp down more. They tend to stymie the creativity of their employees because they're just focused on getting through the next week. And so you have to balance control with also empowering your employees so your employees don't feel frustrated. And lastly, you're going to see some increased conflicts, especially between groups. One, because communication is more of a challenge, and because of all these other reasons we just stated, that work groups, within groups, and between groups, the communication is harder. The perception of trust and all those other things become weaker. It can lead to increased conflict.